On the 17th of March, 1554, a barge moved slowly up the River Thames toward the Tower of London. It was Palm Sunday. The rain had not stopped for days, and the river was high and grey and unwelcoming. Inside the barge sat a young woman of 20. She wore no crown. She held no title beyond Lady Elizabeth. She was, at that moment, the most dangerous person in England, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was, and who others believed she might one day become. She had been accused of conspiracy against her own sister, the Queen. The charge, if proven, carried a single sentence: death. As the barge approached the tower, Elizabeth refused to leave it. She sat in the rain and argued with the men sent to escort her inside, delaying the moment for as long as she could, because she understood, better than almost anyone alive, what the Tower of London meant for a member of her family. Her own mother had walked through a gate very much like this one 18 years earlier. Her mother had not walked back out. Finally, forced from the boat, Elizabeth is said to have sat down on the wet stone steps of the tower and refused to move. A servant urged her forward, out of the rain. She answered, according to the traditions that later grew around this moment, that she would rather sit here than go one step further into a place that might become her grave. She was wrong about one thing. She would leave the tower alive. But the woman who walked in that day, frightened, unmarried, uncertain of her own survival, would become one of the most powerful rulers in English history. She would reign for nearly 45 years. She would defeat the greatest naval power in Europe. She would preside over an explosion of English literature, exploration, and identity that still shapes how the world imagines England today. And she would do all of it without a husband, without an heir of her own body, and without ever fully escaping the shadow of the mother she barely remembered. So how did a young woman who entered the Tower of London as a prisoner, suspected of treason by her own sister, end up as one of the most formidable monarchs Europe had ever produced? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a marriage that split a country in two, and a birth that was supposed to change everything, but almost didn't. Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September, 1533 at Greenwich Palace. Her birth should have been the triumphant conclusion to one of the most disruptive love affairs in European history. Instead, it was a disappointment that her parents could barely hide. Her father was King Henry VIII, a man who had already broken with the Roman Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and reshaped the religious landscape of an entire nation, all so that he could marry her mother, Anne Boleyn. Henry had been married before to Catherine of Aragon for over 2 decades. Catherine had given him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving son. In a world where female rulers were viewed with suspicion, and where a kingdom's stability was believed to depend on clear male succession, the lack of a son was to Henry an emergency. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed, unlawful in the eyes of God, and that this was why no son had lived. Anne Boleyn was clever, sharp-tongued, ambitious, and unwilling to become merely another mistress. For years she resisted Henry's advances unless he could offer her marriage and the crown that came with it. Henry, obsessed, was willing to break the Catholic Church in England to get her. He created a new church, with himself at its head, and had his marriage to Catherine annulled. In 1533 he finally married Anne. Astrologers and physicians had assured the court that the child Anne carried was a boy. Henry had already ordered documents prepared announcing the birth of a prince. When Elizabeth was born instead, the word prince on those documents had to be hastily altered, and Sesti added by hand to make it read princess. It was not, in the language of the time, a great outcome, but it was not immediately a catastrophe either. Henry still had reason to hope for a son later. Anne was young. There would, everyone assumed, be more children. There were not. Anne suffered further pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. Henry's patience, never generous to begin with, ran out. By 1536, less than 3 years after Elizabeth's birth, Henry had grown infatuated with another woman at court, Jane Seymour, and had grown convinced himself that Anne had betrayed him. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest and treason, charges that most historians today consider almost certainly fabricated, the product of a political purge rather than genuine evidence. She was tried, convicted, and on the 19th of May, 1536, executed by sword on Tower Green, inside the very fortress Elizabeth would one day be imprisoned in herself. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. She likely had no direct memory of her mother's death, but she grew up in a world shaped entirely by its consequences. Almost immediately, Elizabeth's status collapsed. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid, retroactively annulled, which meant that in the eyes of the law, Elizabeth had never legitimately been the daughter of a king and queen at all. She was stripped of the title princess and demoted to Lady Elizabeth. She was officially a bastard. This single fact, her illegitimacy, would follow Elizabeth for the rest of her life. It would be used against her by enemies at court, by foreign powers who questioned her right to rule, and by the Catholic Church, which never recognised her parents' marriage and therefore never recognised her at all. We cannot know exactly how the loss of her mother and the disgrace that followed shaped Elizabeth emotionally. The surviving evidence does not tell us her private thoughts as a small child. What we do know is this: Elizabeth grew up fast, and she grew up watchful. Servants who cared for her in these years described a child who was unusually observant, unusually careful with her words, for someone so young. It is possible, though historians are divided on how much weight to give this, that a childhood built on sudden, violent reversal of fortune taught Elizabeth, early and permanently, that power was never as secure as it looked. She would spend the rest of her life proving she had learned that lesson.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
Following Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour within 11 days. In 1537, Jane gave Henry what Anne never had: a living son, Edward. Jane died shortly after childbirth, likely from complications, a common and devastating risk of the era regardless of rank. Henry would go on to marry 3 more times: Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr, bringing his total to 6 wives, a fact so extraordinary that it has overshadowed almost everything else about his reign in popular memory. For Elizabeth, this revolving cast of stepmothers meant a childhood spent largely apart from her father, raised in a series of households, moved between royal residences and dependent on the temperament of whichever woman currently held the position of queen. Some of these relationships mattered more than others. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, took a genuine interest in Elizabeth's education and well-being, and for several years functioned as something close to a real mother figure. Elizabeth was bright, extraordinarily so by every surviving account. She was taught by leading scholars of the day, including Roger Ascham, and became fluent in multiple languages: French, Italian, Latin, and Greek, alongside her native English. She read history, rhetoric, and theology. She was trained not merely to be decorative, but to think. This mattered enormously. In courts across Europe, royal daughters were frequently educated to a reasonable standard, but rarely to the level Elizabeth received. Her education gave her tools that would serve her for the rest of her life: the ability to write her own speeches, to negotiate with foreign ambassadors in their own languages, to out-argue counsellors who assumed they could outmaneuver a woman. At the time, this level of education may have seemed like simple royal privilege, an unremarkable extension of Catherine Parr's household routines. But it would eventually become one of Elizabeth's sharpest political weapons. Her formative years were also marked by instability that went beyond the ordinary. Her half-sister Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was nearly 2 decades older, devoutly Catholic, and had grown up watching her own mother be humiliated and displaced by Anne Boleyn. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth would remain, for the rest of their lives, tangled in resentment, obligation, and mutual suspicion. Her half-brother Edward, Jane Seymour's son, was younger, sickly, and, as the only male heir, the centre of the entire kingdom's hopes. Elizabeth existed in an uncomfortable middle position, neither fully legitimate nor fully dismissed. She was included in the line of succession by an Act of Parliament in 1544, restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the succession after Edward, even though neither had been reinstated as legitimate. It was a pragmatic compromise, not a statement of affection. Henry wanted options. Whether he loved Elizabeth is a question historians still debate. What is clear is that he found her politically useful to keep in reserve. Henry VIII died in January 1547. Elizabeth was 13 years old. Her brother Edward, aged 9, became King Edward VI, and almost immediately Elizabeth's life took a turn that would teach her, in the most uncomfortable way possible, exactly how dangerous royal proximity to power could be, even for a teenage girl who had done nothing wrong. After Henry's death, Catherine Parr, his widow, wasted little time before remarrying. Her new husband was Thomas Seymour, the ambitious and rather reckless brother of the late Jane Seymour, and uncle to the young new king Edward VI. Elizabeth, now 13, stayed on in Catherine Parr's household, which meant she now found herself living under the same roof as Thomas Seymour. What happened next has kept historians talking for centuries, and the evidence we have, mostly testimony gathered later, under pressure, as part of a formal investigation, deserves a careful, measured reading. Still, even told gently, the story is an uncomfortable one, by any era's standards. Thomas Seymour, then in his late 30s, began showing a pattern of behaviour toward his teenage step-relative that crossed a clear line, slipping into her bedchamber in the mornings, sometimes before she'd had a chance to dress, tickling her, playfully swatting at her. The kind of behaviour that, even at the time, left members of the household visibly uneasy whenever they spoke of it later. Catherine Parr, remarkably, appears to have initially treated this as harmless family horseplay, even joining in on at least one occasion. Modern readers, and indeed many at the time, would recognise this instead as grooming, an adult using a position of trust and household intimacy to blur boundaries with the child in his care. Eventually, Catherine Parr seems to have recognised the danger, or grown suspicious of a genuine attraction between her husband and her young ward. Elizabeth was removed from the household and sent elsewhere to live in 1548. Catherine Parr died later that year following childbirth. With his wife dead, Thomas Seymour's ambitions did not cool. They escalated. He began manoeuvring for greater influence over young King Edward, his nephew, and reportedly revived the idea of marrying Elizabeth himself, which would have given him a direct claim to influence over two separate paths to the throne. This was, in the political climate of the time, an act bordering on treason. A subject attempting to marry into the royal succession without official sanction was viewed as a direct threat to the crown's stability. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested. Investigators, led by his own brother, the powerful Lord Protector Edward Seymour, turned their attention to Elizabeth's household, interrogating her servants, her governess Cat Ashley, and her financial officer Thomas Parry, searching for evidence that Elizabeth had been complicit in a secret plan to marry Thomas Seymour without royal consent. Elizabeth, 15 years old, was placed under a form of house arrest and subjected to intense hostile questioning, conducted not directly by torture, but by a skilled and deliberately intimidating interrogator, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, who was under explicit instruction to break her composure and extract a confession. She did not break. Her servants, under far more direct pressure, gave inconsistent and damaging testimony. Cat Ashley admitted to gossiping about a potential marriage between Elizabeth and Seymour, but Elizabeth herself, in her written responses and eventually in person, maintained a controlled, careful, legally precise defence. She denied wrongdoing without appearing evasive. She defended her servants without incriminating herself, and in a moment that has become one of the most quoted episodes of her early life, she demanded, and eventually received, the right to write directly to the Lord Protector to defend her reputation, insisting that rumours were circulating that she was already secretly pregnant by Seymour, and that she wanted this publicly denied, in writing, by the government itself to protect her honour. It worked. No formal charges were ever brought against Elizabeth. Thomas Seymour was convicted of treason on other separate grounds and executed in March 1549. Historians have long debated what this episode taught Elizabeth. The evidence does not allow us to know her private feelings with certainty, but the practical lesson is impossible to miss. At 15, Elizabeth had learned that her body, her reputation, and her private choices were never entirely her own. That as a woman standing near the throne, any rumour of impropriety could threaten her freedom and her life, and that the only real defence was total, disciplined self-control. It is a lesson she would apply, with almost unnerving consistency, for the rest of her reign. The decision seemed, to those around her, simply the outcome of a frightening scandal safely survived. It was anything but. The pattern set here, intense scrutiny of her body, her marriageability, her honesty under interrogation, would repeat again and again at far higher stakes for the next 5 decades. To understand what happened to Elizabeth next, we need to step back from her personally and look at the larger world she was inheriting, because the danger she survived under Thomas Seymour was only a preview of a much larger, much more dangerous conflict tearing England apart, the question of religion. Henry VIII's break from Rome had not been primarily a theological decision. It began as a practical solution to his marital problems. He needed an annulment the Pope would not grant, so he created a church that would. But once the Church of England existed, with the king as its head instead of the Pope, it opened the door to a much deeper transformation. Protestant ideas, already spreading across continental Europe through reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, found fertile ground in England. Under Edward VI, Elizabeth's younger half-brother raised by Protestant tutors and advisers, England moved further and faster toward Protestantism than Henry himself had ever intended. Church services were reformed. The English Book of Common Prayer was introduced. Traditional Catholic practices were stripped away. Edward, however, was never healthy. He died in 1553 at just 15 years old, having reigned only 6 years. His death triggered a succession crisis that would consume England for the next several years, and which Elizabeth watched unfold from a position of extreme personal vulnerability. Edward, fearing that the Catholic Mary would undo his Protestant reforms, had attempted, with the backing of powerful court factions, to alter the succession before his death, bypassing both of his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, in favour of a Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. This attempt collapsed within days of Edward's death. Public support for Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter and the rightful heir under existing law, was overwhelming. Jane Grey's brief 9-day reign ended in her arrest, and later her execution. Mary became Queen in 1553, the first woman to rule England in her own right in generations, and Mary was determined to do what Edward had feared, reverse the Reformation and return England to Catholicism and to obedience to Rome. This is the world Elizabeth stood inside as a 20-year-old woman, a country whose religious identity had been violently reshaped twice within 20 years, ruled now by a devoutly Catholic queen who distrusted her Protestant-leaning half-sister and who understood, correctly, that Elizabeth represented a living, breathing alternative to her own rule for anyone unhappy with Catholic restoration. At the time, Elizabeth's own religious convictions were, and remain, difficult to pin down with certainty. She had been raised largely within a Protestant-leaning household under Catherine Parr and Edward's regime, but she was also politically savvy enough to outwardly conform to Mary's Catholic requirements once Mary took the throne, attending Catholic Mass, at least in public, to avoid provoking her sister. It did not save her from suspicion, and that suspicion is precisely what led, in the spring of 1554, to the scene we opened with: Elizabeth, 20 years old, sitting in the rain outside the Tower of London, accused of involvement in a rebellion against her own sister's throne. The rebellion that brought Elizabeth to the Tower is known to history as Wyatt's Rebellion, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger in January and February 1554. Its immediate trigger was Mary's announced marriage to Philip of Spain, a match deeply unpopular among English Protestants and nationalists alike, who feared England would become little more than a Spanish satellite, dragged into Habsburg wars and subordinated to a foreign crown. Wyatt raised an armed force in Kent and marched toward London. The rebellion ultimately failed. Wyatt was captured and eventually executed. But under interrogation, his name, and the names of others involved in earlier related plots, kept surfacing alongside Elizabeth's. The core accusation was this: that Elizabeth had known of, and potentially encouraged, a plan to depose Mary and place Elizabeth herself on the throne. If proven, this was unambiguous treason, and treason carried the penalty of death, a penalty Mary's own government had already demonstrated it was willing to apply to royal blood, having executed the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey only weeks earlier. Elizabeth denied everything. Wyatt himself, even under the threat of torture and on the scaffold before his own execution, refused to implicate her directly in any conspiracy. There was no confession, no letter in Elizabeth's hand, no piece of hard evidence connecting her to the plot. What existed instead was suspicion, proximity, and motive. The fact that Elizabeth was, simply by existing as a Protestant alternative to Mary's Catholic rule, a natural rallying point for anyone opposed to the Queen, whether Elizabeth had personally invited that role or not. This is one of the defining patterns of Elizabeth's early life, and it is worth pausing on. For much of her 20s, Elizabeth's greatest danger came not from anything she did, but from what she represented to other people. She could be entirely innocent of a plot and still be executed for it, simply because rebels claimed her name, or because her survival was politically inconvenient to those in power. Mary's council was divided over what to do with her. Some, including Stephen Gardiner, the powerful Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor, appear to have genuinely believed Elizabeth guilty, or at minimum saw her as too dangerous to allow to live freely. Others on the council, along with Mary's own husband Philip, for complicated reasons of his own, including a desire to avoid the political fallout of executing a Protestant princess with growing public sympathy, argued for caution. Elizabeth was held in the Tower for 2 months, in conditions of genuine uncertainty about whether she would leave alive. She wrote to Mary directly, in a letter dated the morning she was due to be taken to the Tower, protesting her innocence and, in a detail that later became one of the most famous stories of her imprisonment, deliberately taking so long to write it, drawing careful diagonal lines through the blank space at the bottom of the page that the tide turned against the planned time of her transport, delaying her arrival by a full day. It was a small act of resistance, but a telling one. Even facing the possibility of execution, Elizabeth was thinking tactically, buying time, looking for any advantage, however small. No conclusive evidence was ever produced against her. In May 1554, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, not fully pardoned, not restored to trust, but moved instead to a form of extended house arrest at Woodstock, under the custody of a minor official named Sir Henry Bedingfield. The months at Woodstock were lonely, restrictive, and psychologically grinding. Elizabeth was watched constantly, denied most correspondence, and kept in a state of prolonged uncertainty about her future. And yet, and this matters for understanding who she would become, she survived it without ever giving her enemies the confession or the misstep they needed. By late 1555, Elizabeth was permitted to return to court, though her relationship with Mary remained cold and watchful for the rest of Mary's reign. The two women who shared a father, and almost nothing else, coexisted uneasily. Mary desperate for a Catholic heir of her own body to prevent Elizabeth's succession, and Elizabeth carefully, patiently waiting. Mary's hoped-for pregnancies never produced a living child. Her marriage to Philip of Spain grew strained and largely absent, as Philip spent most of his time abroad managing his vast European territories. Mary's government became associated, fairly or not, with religious persecution, the burning of Protestant dissenters that would later earn her the nickname Bloody Mary in English Protestant memory, and with the loss of Calais, England's last remaining continental territory, a national humiliation that damaged her popularity badly in her final years. Mary I died on the 17th of November, 1558, likely from complications related to a uterine tumour, still believing until close to the end that she might be pregnant. Elizabeth was 25 years old. According to the tradition that grew up around this moment, she received the news of her accession while sitting beneath an oak tree at Hatfield House, and is said to have responded in Latin, with words from the 118th Psalm, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." Whether or not the scene happened exactly as later chroniclers described it, the underlying truth is not in dispute. The frightened young woman who had once sat in the rain outside the Tower of London, uncertain if she would live to see 30, was now Queen of England. Elizabeth did not inherit a stable kingdom. She inherited a mess. England in November 1558 was religiously divided, financially strained, militarily humiliated by the loss of Calais, and diplomatically isolated. The treasury was in debt. The currency had been devalued under previous reigns to the point of causing real economic damage. England's population had recently endured a severe influenza epidemic. And the country's religious identity, Catholic under Mary, Protestant under Edward, uncertain now under Elizabeth, remained a live and dangerous question, one that had already produced executions on both sides depending on who held power. Beyond England's shores, the situation was equally precarious. France and Spain, the two dominant powers of Western Europe, were both Catholic, both far wealthier and more militarily powerful than England, and both watching closely to see what kind of ruler this new, unmarried, 25-year-old Protestant-leaning queen would turn out to be. Scotland, England's northern neighbour, was allied closely with France through the Auld Alliance, and ruled in the name of a young queen, Mary Stuart, a name that would become central to the entire story of Elizabeth's reign, though almost nobody watching in 1558 yet understood how central. And there was one more problem, more personal and more immediate than any of these. Elizabeth herself was, in the eyes of much of Catholic Europe, illegitimate. the Pope had never recognised Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, which meant that in Catholic eyes, Elizabeth had no legitimate claim to the throne at all, and that the true Queen of England, by Catholic reasoning, was in fact Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, who had a legitimate royal bloodline through her descent from Henry VII. This single fact, Elizabeth's contested legitimacy, would shadow her entire reign. It meant that Elizabeth was never simply defending her throne against ordinary political rivals. She was defending the very legal basis of her right to exist as queen at all, against a rival who, for many Catholics both inside and outside England, had a better claim than she did. It may have seemed, in the earliest days of her reign, that this was a distant theoretical problem. It would not remain distant for long. Elizabeth's immediate task, however, was more practical. She needed to build a government, and the choices she made in her first weeks as queen reveal a great deal about the kind of ruler she intended to be. Her first and most important appointment was William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, as her principal Secretary of State. It was the beginning of a working partnership that would last, with only brief interruptions, for the next 4 decades, arguably the most important political relationship of Elizabeth's entire reign. Cecil was cautious, meticulous, Protestant and fiercely loyal. He and Elizabeth did not always agree. They argued, sometimes bitterly, over major decisions for years, but Elizabeth trusted his judgment more consistently than almost anyone else's, and Cecil, in turn, structured much of his life around protecting her and her throne. On religion, Elizabeth pursued a strategy that would define her reign: compromise, deliberately engineered to avoid the extremes that had caused so much bloodshed under her siblings. The religious settlement of 1559 established a Protestant Church of England, with Elizabeth as its supreme governor rather than supreme head, a careful linguistic choice designed to be less provocative to Catholic sensibilities than her father's title had been. The new church retained more traditional ceremony and structure than the more radical Protestant reforms under Edward had allowed, in a deliberate attempt to make the settlement tolerable to as many of her subjects as possible, Catholic and Protestant alike. Elizabeth is often quoted, though the precise wording is debated among historians, as saying she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, meaning that she was less interested in enforcing private belief than in securing outward conformity and loyalty to the state church. It was a pragmatic, not necessarily a tolerant policy. Catholics who practised quietly and did not challenge her authority were, in the early years of her reign, largely left alone. Catholics who actively worked against her, and there would be many, particularly as her reign went on, were treated as traitors, not heretics, at least in official framing, even when the underlying motive was clearly religious. This distinction mattered enormously, and it is one of the more historically debated aspects of Elizabeth's rule. Was her religious settlement a genuine, principled attempt at tolerance in an age of extremism, or was it simply a shrewd political calculation, avoiding the kind of religious civil war that had devastated France, while still ruthlessly punishing anyone who threatened her personal authority? The evidence suggests both readings have merit. Elizabeth's own faith seems to have been genuine, moderate, and instinctively suspicious of extremism on either side. But she was also, from her very first council meetings, a deeply pragmatic political operator, and the religious settlement served her political survival as much as it served any theological conviction. Within a year of taking the throne, Elizabeth had achieved something none of her siblings had managed: a religious settlement stable enough to hold, a functioning government built around trusted advisers, and, for the moment, peace with France and Spain. But one problem remained unresolved, and it was the problem the entire country wanted answered above all others. Who would Elizabeth marry, and who would give England its next king? From the very first weeks of her reign, Elizabeth's council, her parliament, and much of her kingdom assumed she would marry, and marry quickly. A queen without a husband was, in the political thinking of the 16th century, an unstable and temporary arrangement, a placeholder until a king could take his proper place, or until an heir could be produced to secure the succession. Everyone expected Elizabeth's unmarried status to be resolved within a year or two. It never was resolved, not in the way anyone expected, and this single fact, Elizabeth's refusal to marry, became one of the defining and most fiercely debated aspects of her entire reign. Suitors came from across Europe. Philip II of Spain, her own brother-in-law by his earlier marriage to Mary, proposed early in Elizabeth's reign, calculating that a marriage alliance with England would keep the country within Spain's sphere of influence and prevent it from drifting toward Protestant alliances with France's rivals. Elizabeth declined carefully without fully closing the door, a pattern of diplomatic non-commitment she would repeat for years, extracting maximum political value from the possibility of marriage without ever actually consenting to it. Archdukes of Austria, princes of Sweden, and, most seriously for the longest sustained period, the Duke of Anjou and later the Duke of Alençon, both members of the French royal family, were pursued as potential matches at various points across 2 decades. The Alençon courtship in particular, in the late 1570s and early 1580s, progressed further than any other, with the French prince actually visiting England and Elizabeth appearing, to the surprise of her own court, genuinely fond of him personally, even as she was well into her 40s by that point. But every serious marriage negotiation eventually collapsed, for a mixture of political, religious, and, historians continue to debate, personal reasons. The political reasoning is the easiest to reconstruct. Any foreign marriage risked entangling England in the marital partners' wars and rivalries, exactly the fear that had made Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain so unpopular. A Catholic husband risked reigniting exactly the kind of religious conflict Elizabeth's settlement had been designed to prevent. And crucially, marriage itself carried real political risk for Elizabeth personally. A husband, under the legal and social norms of the 16th century, would likely expect to rule alongside her, or even in her place. Elizabeth had watched her sister Mary's authority become entangled with, and in some ways subordinated to, her husband Philip's interests. It is probable, though we cannot know this with certainty since Elizabeth left no private confession explaining her reasoning, that Elizabeth had no intention of repeating that arrangement. There is also the closer, more personal story. Robert Dudley. Dudley, later created Earl of Leicester, had known Elizabeth since childhood. Some accounts suggest they were imprisoned in the Tower at roughly the same time during Mary's reign, though on separate charges. From the earliest days of Elizabeth's reign, Dudley was unmistakably her favourite, given prominent positions at court, showered with gifts and land, and kept in close, near constant proximity to the Queen, in a manner that provoked open gossip across Europe about the true nature of their relationship. The relationship became a genuine scandal in 1560, when Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at their home, with a broken neck and, according to some accounts, other injuries. The death was officially ruled an accident by a coroner's inquest, but the timing, with Dudley free, at least in theory, to marry the Queen, created an immediate and damaging cloud of suspicion that Dudley, or people acting in his interest, had arranged his wife's death. No evidence has ever conclusively proven murder, and many modern historians lean toward accident, or, more darkly, the possibility that Amy Robsart may have been suffering from a medical condition, a theory involving breast cancer weakening her bones has been proposed, that made a fatal fall more likely. But the scandal was politically catastrophic regardless of the truth. Marrying Dudley in the immediate aftermath would have been, for Elizabeth, an act of extraordinary political recklessness, potentially fatal to her reputation and her throne. She did not marry him, but she also, notably, never fully let him go. Dudley remained at the centre of her court and her personal affections for the rest of his life, even as he eventually married another woman, Lettice Knollys, in 1578, a marriage Elizabeth reportedly reacted to with fury and lasting coldness toward Lettice specifically, even while maintaining her relationship with Dudley himself. What was Elizabeth's true feeling toward Dudley? Historians have debated this for centuries, and the honest answer is that we cannot know with certainty. The evidence suggests a relationship of deep, long-lasting personal affection, possibly the closest thing to romantic love Elizabeth ever experienced, combined with an absolute unwavering refusal to let that affection compromise her political independence. It is one of the great unresolved tensions of her life, a woman capable of deep personal attachment who nonetheless chose, again and again, across decades and multiple serious suitors, to remain formally unmarried. Over time, Elizabeth herself began to construct a public explanation for her unmarried status that transformed what might have looked like a political liability into one of her greatest political assets, the image of the Virgin Queen, married instead to her kingdom and her people. In a famous speech to Parliament in 1559, responding to pressure to marry, she reportedly said that it would be sufficient that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin. Later, in a speech to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, which we will return to, she would use similarly deliberate, carefully constructed language about her own identity as a ruler who had chosen duty over personal life. This image, carefully cultivated through portraiture, poetry, court pageantry and Elizabeth's own rhetoric, became one of the central pillars of her political authority. A woman ruling alone, in a deeply patriarchal age, needed some framework to explain her unusual position that did not appear weak or improper. The Virgin Queen mythology provided exactly that. Not an absence of love or desire, but a sacrifice, a marriage of a higher kind to the nation itself. Whether this was sincere personal philosophy or brilliant political theatre, or, as is most likely, some combination of both, it worked. By the later decades of her reign, Elizabeth's unmarried status had transformed from a source of anxiety into a defining symbol of her strength and independence. But in the 1560s, none of that outcome was yet certain, and while England debated who its queen might marry, a far more dangerous problem was developing just across the northern border, one that would occupy nearly 30 years of Elizabeth's reign, and that would eventually force her into the single most difficult decision of her life. Her name was Mary Stuart. She was Queen of Scots by birth, briefly Queen of France by marriage, and, in the eyes of many Catholics across Europe, the rightful Queen of England as well. She was also Elizabeth's cousin, descended from Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret Tudor, which gave her a real, legitimate blood claim to the English throne, one that Catholic Europe considered stronger than Elizabeth's own, given the Pope's refusal to recognise Elizabeth's parents' marriage. For nearly 3 decades, the relationship between these two women, who met in person exactly 0 times in their entire lives, despite ruling neighbouring kingdoms for years, would become one of the defining rivalries of the 16th century and one of the most psychologically fascinating relationships in English history, precisely because it existed almost entirely through letters, intermediaries, and imagination. Mary's life, before she ever became England's problem, had already been extraordinary. Sent to France as a child to be raised at the French court and eventually married to the future King Francis II, she became Queen of France briefly, before Francis's early death left her a widow at 18. She returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule a kingdom she barely knew, having spent most of her life abroad, in a country whose Protestant nobility deeply distrusted their Catholic French-raised queen. Mary's personal life in Scotland unravelled with startling speed. Her second marriage, to her cousin Lord Darnley, collapsed into mutual contempt and violence. Darnley was murdered in 1567 under circumstances that strongly implicated the Earl of Bothwell, who Mary then controversially married just months later, a decision that scandalised both Scotland and the wider European courts, and that many historians believe fatally damaged what remaining credibility she had among the Scottish nobility. Facing open rebellion, Mary was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James, and was briefly imprisoned in Scotland before escaping in 1568. With nowhere else to turn, Mary fled south, into England, into the territory of the cousin whose throne she had, at least in the eyes of many Catholics, a better legal claim to than Elizabeth herself. This placed Elizabeth in an almost impossible position, and it is worth pausing to genuinely understand both sides of this dilemma, because it would define the next 19 years. From Elizabeth's perspective, Mary was simultaneously a fellow anointed monarch, someone Elizabeth felt an instinctive, almost sacred obligation to protect, since attacking the legitimacy of one queen's authority implicitly threatened the legitimacy of all monarchy, including her own, and an active, ongoing security threat, a living rallying point for every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth's throne for the rest of Mary's life. Elizabeth could not simply send Mary back to Scotland, where Mary's enemies would likely have killed her. She could not send Mary to France, where she might raise an invasion force, and she was extremely reluctant for years to imprison or execute a fellow queen, a decision that would set a deeply uncomfortable precedent about what could be done to anointed monarchs who lost power. From Mary's perspective, and this is a perspective few documentaries fully explore, she had arrived in England as a refugee seeking her cousin's protection, not as an invading enemy. She had lost her throne, her son, and her freedom of movement within a matter of months. Held first in loose, then in increasingly strict custody, across a series of English castles and manor houses for nearly 2 decades, Mary's own sense of grievance was, from her point of view, entirely justified. She had come to Elizabeth for help and received imprisonment instead. For roughly 18 years, Elizabeth kept Mary in a form of comfortable but genuine captivity, moving her between different custodians, allowing correspondence but monitoring it, and repeatedly resisting pressure from her own council, especially from Cecil, and later from Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, to have Mary formally tried and executed as the ongoing threat she represented. And Mary was, whether through her own direct involvement or through the actions of supporters acting in her name, at the centre of plot after plot against Elizabeth's life throughout these years. The Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, the Babington plot in 1586, each involved, at varying levels of proven direct involvement, plans to assassinate Elizabeth, incite Catholic rebellion, and place Mary on the English throne, often with the backing of Spain or the papacy. It was the Babington plot that finally forced Elizabeth's hand. Walsingham's intelligence network, one of the most sophisticated espionage operations in Europe at the time, had been intercepting and decoding Mary's secret correspondence for months, using a double agent to funnel letters through a hidden channel that Mary believed was secure. In the summer of 1586, Walsingham's agents intercepted a letter in which Mary appeared to explicitly approve of a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. Historians continue to debate the precise nature of Mary's involvement, whether she fully understood and endorsed the assassination element of the plot, or whether her approval was more general, related to plans for rescue and rebellion, with the assassination detail added or emphasised by Walsingham's own agents to strengthen the case against her. What is not disputed is that the letter, real or partially engineered, gave Elizabeth's government the legal justification it had been seeking for nearly 2 decades. Mary was tried, convicted of treason, and sentenced to death. And Elizabeth, who had resisted this exact outcome for 18 years, now had to actually sign the order. Before we go further, it's worth pausing to remember where this story began. Nearly 30 years earlier, Elizabeth had been a frightened 20-year-old woman, sitting in the rain outside the Tower of London, uncertain whether she would be executed for a conspiracy she almost certainly had no part in. She had entered her reign inheriting a bankrupt, divided, diplomatically isolated kingdom, expected by everyone around her to marry quickly and hand real authority to a husband. She had watched her own mother executed on evidence historians now widely consider fabricated, and had spent her adolescence learning, through direct and painful experience, that royal women's bodies, reputations and choices were rarely fully their own. Now, in 1587, at 53 years old, Elizabeth was one of the longest reigning and most politically skillful monarchs in England's history, unmarried by her own repeated choice, having outmanoeuvred nearly every attempt by her council and by foreign powers to control her through marriage, having built and maintained a religious settlement that had held for nearly 3 decades without the kind of large-scale civil war that had devastated France. But she was also, in this moment, about to make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, whether to execute her own cousin, a fellow anointed queen, a woman who had come to her, years earlier, as a refugee asking for protection. This is the moment to hold on to the central tension of Elizabeth's entire character. She was, by any measure, one of the shrewdest political operators of her age, capable of extraordinary patience, calculation, and self-control. And she was also, throughout her life, a woman who genuinely agonized over decisions with irreversible human costs, who delayed, hesitated, and revised her position again and again on the most consequential choices of her reign, in a manner her own advisers frequently found maddening. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, would bring both of these qualities into direct, painful collision. For months after Mary's conviction, Elizabeth delayed signing the death warrant. Parliament petitioned her to proceed. Her council pressed her relentlessly. Foreign ambassadors reported home that the English Queen seemed genuinely tormented by the decision, not, they believed, out of any doubt about Mary's guilt, but out of a deeper fear about what it meant to kill an anointed monarch, and what precedent that might set for her own life and reign. There was also a practical fear. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was Mary's heir, and, crucially, was also next in line to the English throne after Elizabeth herself, since Elizabeth had no children. Executing James's mother risked permanently poisoning Elizabeth's relationship with the man who might one day rule England. It also risked provoking Catholic Europe, particularly Spain, already a growing threat, into open war, framing an invasion of England as a righteous crusade to avenge a martyred Catholic queen. Elizabeth finally signed the warrant on the 1st of February, 1587. But even after signing it, she reportedly instructed her secretary, William Davison, to hold it rather than send it immediately, leaving herself, according to later accounts and her own subsequent claims, room to reconsider. Her council did not give her that room, acting with what may have been genuine urgency to prevent Elizabeth from changing her mind, or acting to deliberately remove the decision from her hands entirely. Members of her Privy Council convened without her explicit final authorization and dispatched the warrant. Mary was executed on the 8th of February, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle. When Elizabeth learned that the execution had already taken place, her reaction, by every contemporary account, was extreme. She wept, she raged, she had Davison arrested and imprisoned, formally blaming him for acting without her final consent, even though it is clear from the surviving evidence that Elizabeth herself had signed the warrant and that her council genuinely believed they were carrying out her intention. Was this reaction genuine grief and horror at what had been done in her name? Or was it, at least in part, a calculated political performance, an attempt to distance herself publicly from an execution she knew would be deeply controversial, particularly among Catholic powers abroad, while allowing the practical outcome she had at some level decided was necessary? Historians remain divided, and the honest answer is that both explanations likely contain some truth. Elizabeth was capable of profound, sincere anguish over difficult decisions. She was also capable of using that anguish, real or performed, as political cover. The two are not mutually exclusive. What is certain is the consequence. Mary Stuart's execution removed permanently the most significant internal Catholic threat to Elizabeth's throne, and it removed any remaining diplomatic restraint that had kept Philip II of Spain from moving toward open war. The decision seemed, in its immediate aftermath, to be primarily about resolving a domestic security threat. It was anything but. Within a year, it would help trigger the single most famous military confrontation of Elizabeth's entire reign. Philip II of Spain had been, for decades, the single most powerful monarch in Europe, ruler of Spain, its vast American colonies, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples and Portugal after 1580, commanding a treasury swollen with silver from the New World, and a military reputation few dared challenge directly. He had once been Elizabeth's brother-in-law, briefly her suitor, and for years a cautious, if uneasy, diplomatic counterpart. That relationship had deteriorated steadily across the 1570s and 1580s for a tangle of interconnected reasons. English privateers, most famously Francis Drake, had spent years raiding Spanish shipping and colonial ports in the Americas, operating with Elizabeth's tacit, unofficial encouragement, enriching the English crown while draining Spanish treasure and Spanish patience. England had provided military and financial support to Protestant rebels fighting Spanish rule in the Netherlands, directly undermining Philip's authority over one of his most valuable territories. And now, with Mary Stuart's execution, Philip had lost his strongest remaining justification for restraint, while gaining a powerful new religious and political motive to act, framing an invasion of England as a holy crusade to remove a heretic queen and restore Catholic rule. In 1588, Philip launched the Spanish Armada, a fleet of roughly 130 ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, intended to sail up the English Channel, link with a waiting Spanish army in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, and transport that army across to invade England directly. For England, this was an existential threat of a scale the country had not faced in generations. Spain's navy and army were, on paper, vastly superior to anything England could field. If the Armada succeeded, Elizabeth's entire reign, the religious settlement, the political stability she had spent 30 years building, quite possibly her own life, could end within weeks. What followed has become one of the most mythologized episodes in English history, and it is worth separating carefully the established fact from the legend that later grew around it. Established fact. The Armada entered the English Channel in late July 1588, sailing in a tight defensive crescent formation. English ships, smaller but faster and more manoeuvrable, harassed the Spanish fleet along its route without managing to inflict decisive damage in early engagements. The turning point came at Calais, where the English used fireships, vessels deliberately set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored Spanish fleet at night, to force the Armada to break formation and scatter in panic. In the ensuing Battle of Gravelines, English ships inflicted significant damage on the disorganised Spanish fleet. Crucially, though, it was not primarily English cannon fire that destroyed the Armada. With their formation broken and a direct return south blocked by weather and English positioning, the Spanish fleet was forced to sail north, around Scotland and Ireland, to return home, directly into a series of brutal Atlantic storms. It was this journey, not the Channel battles themselves, that caused the most devastating losses. Ships wrecked on the Irish coast, crews dying of disease, starvation, and drowning in the North Atlantic in numbers that dwarfed combat casualties. Of the roughly 130 ships that set out, perhaps half returned to Spain, and thousands of sailors and soldiers died. The legend that grew around this event is significant and worth naming directly. In English popular memory, the Armada's defeat became mythologized almost immediately as a providential, near-miraculous English naval triumph. Proof, contemporaries claimed, that God himself favoured Protestant England over Catholic Spain. Elizabeth's government actively encouraged this framing, commissioning commemorative medals bearing the Latin phrase "Afflavit Deus et dissipati sunt." God blew, and they were scattered. The reality was more complicated, a combination of English tactical skill, genuine strategic disadvantages built into Spain's overly ambitious invasion plan, and above all, catastrophic weather that had nothing to do with either side's military competence. What is not in dispute, however, is the moment that has become perhaps the single most famous image of Elizabeth's entire reign. Her speech to the assembled English troops at Tilbury, delivered in early August 1588, while the outcome of the Armada campaign was still uncertain to those on the ground in England. Elizabeth, dressed reportedly in a mixture of ceremonial armour and royal regalia, rode among her assembled soldiers and delivered an address that has survived, though scholars debate exactly how faithfully the surviving text reflects her precise, original words, containing what remains one of the most quoted lines in English royal history, that she knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but that she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. It is difficult to overstate how carefully constructed this single sentence was, and how much of Elizabeth's entire political philosophy it distilled into one line. She did not deny or apologise for her womanhood. She acknowledged it directly, refusing the fiction that she was somehow not really a woman ruling. But she separated her physical body from her royal authority, arguing that the heart of monarchy, courage, command, the will to lead, was not inherently gendered, and that she possessed it in full measure regardless of her body's sex. This was not an isolated rhetorical flourish. It was the culmination of 30 years of Elizabeth constructing, deliberately and consistently, a public identity that could hold both truths at once, fully a woman and fully a legitimate, capable monarch in an age that overwhelmingly assumed those two things were incompatible. The Armada's defeat did not end the war with Spain. The conflict dragged on, inconclusively and expensively, for the rest of Elizabeth's reign and beyond. But it transformed Elizabeth's domestic standing. She emerged from 1588 as something closer to a national symbol than a mere monarch. The Queen who had faced down the greatest power in Europe and survived. It was, for Elizabeth personally, close to the peak of her reign. It was also, though almost no one recognised it at the time, the beginning of its slow, difficult final act. The years following the Armada are often remembered in popular culture as the height of the Elizabethan Golden Age, and there is real substance behind that reputation. This was the period when William Shakespeare was writing and performing his early plays in London. Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and a wave of English poets and playwrights produced work that would permanently reshape English literature. Francis Drake had already circumnavigated the globe. English exploration and early colonial ventures, including Walter Raleigh's attempts to establish a colony at Roanoke, were pushing English ambition, however unevenly, across the Atlantic. But it is worth resisting the temptation to view this era purely through a golden celebratory lens, because the reality for most people living through it was considerably harder. The war with Spain continued to drain the treasury for years after the Armada, with no decisive victory in sight. Poor harvests in the 1590s produced genuine famine conditions in parts of England. Inflation eroded the value of wages. Elizabeth's government, for all its cultural glamour at court, presided over a population that experienced real and sometimes severe economic hardship during these same years. At court, meanwhile, Elizabeth was growing old in a role that had always depended in part on carefully managed image and physical presence. She was approaching 60 by the mid-1590s, an old woman by the standards of her era, while continuing to perform through elaborate cosmetics, wigs, and increasingly rigid court ceremony, the image of eternal, ageless royal authority that had defined her public identity for decades. The gap between the aging woman and the sustained public myth of the ever-youthful Virgin Queen was, by this point, substantial and increasingly difficult to maintain, and it was in this final decade of her reign that Elizabeth would face one of the most personally painful betrayals of her life, one that would combine, in a single relationship, nearly every theme that had shaped her entire reign: the danger of favouritism, the fragility of trust, and the impossible tension between personal affection and political survival. His name was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Essex was young, decades younger than Elizabeth, the stepson of her old favourite Robert Dudley, who had died in 1588. He was charismatic, ambitious, militarily inclined, and possessed a talent for courtly charm that made him, from the early 1590s onward, one of the most prominent figures at Elizabeth's court and, by most accounts, genuinely close to the aging queen personally, in a relationship that combined elements of romantic flattery, political mentorship, and something resembling a surrogate father-daughter or even grandmother-grandson emotional dynamic, depending on which historian's interpretation one favours. Essex, however, was also reckless, prone to public displays of temper, and consistently unable to accept the fundamental reality of his relationship with Elizabeth, that no matter how much personal affection existed between them, Elizabeth's authority as queen was not negotiable, and was certainly not something Essex could assume immunity from through personal favour alone. The tension between Essex's ambitions and Elizabeth's authority grew across the 1590s, but it reached a genuine crisis in 1599 when Elizabeth sent Essex to Ireland to suppress a major rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, a campaign that represented one of the largest and most expensive military commitments of Elizabeth's entire reign, and one she desperately needed to succeed. It did not succeed. Essex, given command of a substantial army and enormous resources, achieved little of military value, made an unauthorised truce with Tyrone that Elizabeth had not sanctioned, and then, in an act of extraordinary insubordination, abandoned his post and returned to England without royal permission, arriving unannounced at Elizabeth's private chambers at Nonsuch Palace before she had even finished dressing for the day. It is worth pausing on this scene because it captures something essential about the collapse of their relationship. Essex, it seems, still believed, even after everything, that his personal closeness to Elizabeth would protect him, that he could burst into her most private space, uninvited and unannounced, disobeying direct orders about his conduct in Ireland, and still be received with affection rather than fury. He was wrong. Elizabeth, initially controlled in her reaction in that first private moment, moved quickly afterward to strip Essex of his offices and effectively place him under house arrest, followed eventually by formal investigation into his conduct in Ireland. Essex, humiliated, financially ruined by the loss of royal favour and the lucrative offices that came with it, and increasingly unstable, made a final, catastrophic decision in February 1601. He attempted an armed uprising in London, apparently hoping to rally popular support, seize control of the Queen's person, and force changes in her government and councillors, though how far his ambitions actually extended, whether towards simply removing his political rivals at court or towards something closer to outright rebellion against Elizabeth herself, remains genuinely disputed among historians, and Essex's own confused contradictory statements during a subsequent trial do not fully resolve the question. The uprising collapsed within hours. London did not rise to support him. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, convicted, and, after considerable hesitation on Elizabeth's part, echoing her earlier agony over Mary Stuart's execution 18 years before, executed on the 25th of February 1601. It was, by every account from those close to her, one of the most painful decisions of Elizabeth's entire life. She had known Essex since he was a child. She had, by most reasonable readings of the evidence, loved him in some genuine, complicated way, even as his behaviour across the final years of their relationship had grown increasingly reckless, and disrespectful of the authority she had spent her entire reign defending. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth in her final years as visibly aged and diminished by grief in the aftermath of Essex's execution, a grief that seemed to compound rather than exist separately from the general physical and emotional decline of her final years on the throne. The decision to execute Essex forces us to confront one final time a question that had shadowed Elizabeth's entire reign. How much of her decision-making across 5 decades was genuinely personal, and how much was the disciplined, almost inhuman subordination of personal feeling to political necessity? With Essex, as with Mary Stuart, as with Robert Dudley decades earlier, Elizabeth appears to have felt real, deep personal attachment, and to have ultimately chosen, in the moments that mattered most, the survival of her crown over the survival, literal or relational, of the people she loved. It is one of the most consistent patterns of her entire life. It is also arguably the loneliest one. The final 2 years of Elizabeth's reign were quiet, in the sense that no single dramatic crisis defined them the way the Armada or the Essex Rebellion had. But they were not peaceful. Elizabeth, now approaching 70, had outlived nearly everyone who had shared her early life. William Cecil had died in 1598, Robert Dudley over a decade earlier. Most of the counsellors and companions who had helped her build her reign from its uncertain beginnings were gone. Contemporary observers describe an ageing queen increasingly isolated, prone to long periods of melancholy, and struggling with the practical realities of ruling a kingdom whose economic problems, the ongoing cost of the Spanish War, poor harvests, and rising discontent over royal monopolies granted to court favourites, which functioned as a kind of unofficial taxation deeply unpopular among ordinary merchants and consumers, had not been resolved despite decades on the throne. In November 1601, facing mounting parliamentary anger over these monopoly grants, Elizabeth delivered what has become known as her Golden Speech to Parliament, a carefully constructed address in which she acknowledged the grievances against her, promised reform, and reflected in language that struck many listeners as genuinely moving on the nature of her relationship with her people across more than 4 decades of rule. She spoke of never having been so much enticed with the glorious name of a king or royal authority of a queen, as delighted that God hath made me his instrument to maintain his truth and glory, and to defend this kingdom from peril, dishonour, tyranny, and oppression. It was in many ways a final deliberate summary of the political persona she had spent her entire reign constructing, not a ruler who sought power for its own sake, but a servant of her people who happened to wear a crown. Whether this framing was entirely sincere or a final skillful piece of political theatre from a monarch who had always understood the value of controlled public image is a question historians continue to debate, much like nearly every other major statement of Elizabeth's life. Perhaps by this point the distinction had ceased to matter much, even to Elizabeth herself. The role and the woman had merged after 43 years into something inseparable. The question of succession, the one issue Elizabeth had managed to avoid definitively answering for her entire reign, could not be postponed forever. Elizabeth had never named an official heir, having watched, throughout her own life and reign, how dangerous it could be to have a living alternative claimant to rally around. But by the final years of her life, the practical answer had become increasingly obvious to everyone at court, even if Elizabeth herself never formally confirmed it. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, the same Mary whose execution Elizabeth had once so bitterly mourned, or performed mourning for, stood as the clear Protestant-raised candidate with the strongest hereditary claim. Elizabeth's own health began to decline seriously in early 1603. She reportedly grew withdrawn, refused to go to bed for long periods, standing or sitting for hours, apparently unwilling or unable to lie down. Whether this reflected physical illness, psychological distress, or some combination, the surviving evidence cannot fully clarify. Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March, 1603, at Richmond Palace, at the age of 69, having reigned for 44 years, longer than any English monarch before her. According to later unverifiable tradition, she confirmed on her deathbed, through gestures rather than words, her acceptance of James as her successor. Whether this happened precisely as later accounts describe is impossible to confirm. What is certain is that the succession, when it came, proceeded remarkably smoothly, without the civil war or violent contest that many had feared for decades, and that James VI of Scotland became James I of England within hours of Elizabeth's death. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun with Elizabeth's grandfather Henry VII seizing the throne on a battlefield in 1485, ended with her, the last of Henry VIII's children, the last of Anne Boleyn's blood to sit on the English throne, the frightened girl once imprisoned in the Tower, now dead as the most celebrated monarch her country had ever known. But her story, and the argument over who she truly was, did not end with her death. In many ways it was only beginning. Much of the image we have of Elizabeth I today was not fixed at the moment of her death. It was built, contested, and rebuilt across 4 centuries by people who each had their own reasons for remembering her in a particular way. In the years immediately following her death, under the new Stuart dynasty of James I and his successors, Elizabeth's reputation was, somewhat counterintuitively, used as a political weapon against her own successors. As the Stuart kings, or first James, then his son Charles I, grew increasingly unpopular, particularly over religious policy and their more expansive claims to royal authority, nostalgic memory of Elizabeth's reign was deliberately cultivated by her critics as a contrast, a golden age of Protestant strength, popular touch, and prudent rule, against which the Stuarts appeared to fall badly short. This is one of the great ironies of Elizabeth's posthumous reputation. Much of the Gloriana mythology that later generations have inherited was substantially shaped not during her own lifetime, but afterward, by people using her memory to criticise the kings who followed her. Later centuries added their own layers. Victorian historians, writing during the reign of another long-lived iconic English queen, frequently idealised Elizabeth as a model of steady, patriotic female rule, sometimes glossing over the more ruthless or ambiguous aspects of her decision-making. The executions, the religious persecution of both Catholic and radical Protestant dissenters that occurred under her government, the complicated moral realities of the transatlantic slave trade that English privateers, including figures Elizabeth personally invested in and profited from, had already begun participating in during her reign. 20th and 21st century historians and popular culture, in turn, have often emphasised different facets again. Elizabeth as an early feminist icon, a woman who ruled successfully in a world built to exclude her, or, in more critical reassessments, Elizabeth as a monarch whose famous caution and indecision sometimes had real costs. In Ireland, where her government's suppression of rebellion involved brutal, often devastating military campaigns and famine tactics that caused immense suffering among the Irish population, a part of her reign that popular Golden Age narratives frequently minimise or omit entirely. This is worth sitting with directly, because it complicates the celebratory version of Elizabeth's story that dominates much popular memory. The same queen who is remembered for religious moderation domestically presided over policies in Ireland that modern historians widely regard as brutally violent, including scorched earth campaigns that produced famine conditions among the Irish population, actions justified at the time as necessary suppression of rebellion and Catholic-backed insurgency. But that, viewed from the perspective of their Irish victims, looked considerably less like the benevolent, moderate rule Elizabeth's English domestic reputation suggests. Which brings us back to the question we opened with all those chapters ago. Who was Elizabeth I, really? We began this story with a frightened young woman sitting in the rain, refusing to walk into the Tower of London, uncertain whether she would ever walk back out. We end it with an old woman standing for hours in her final days, unwilling to lie down, at the close of a 44-year reign that had reshaped her country's religion, its literature, its navy, and its sense of itself. Between those two moments lies a life defined by an unusual, almost paradoxical combination of qualities. Elizabeth was, by nearly every account, extraordinarily cautious, famous even among her own contemporaries for delay, indecision, and a reluctance to commit irreversibly to major decisions, whether marriage, war, or the execution of a rival queen. And yet this same cautious woman navigated and ultimately survived some of the most dangerous political currents in English history. A childhood shadowed by her mother's execution, a teenage brush with treason charges under Thomas Seymour, imprisonment in the Tower under her own sister, the ever-present threat of Catholic Europe's hostility to her very legitimacy, the 18-year problem of Mary Stuart, the Spanish Armada, and the devastating betrayal of a favourite she may genuinely have loved. Was Elizabeth's famous caution wisdom, or fear disguised as wisdom? historians remain divided, and the honest answer is probably that it was both, depending on the moment. Her reluctance to marry may have reflected shrewd political calculation about preserving her independent authority, or it may have reflected genuine personal trauma from watching, across her own childhood and adolescence, what happened to royal women whose bodies and reputations became subject to men's control. Her long delay in executing Mary Stuart may have reflected principled reluctance to kill a fellow anointed monarch, or simple fear of the precedent and the diplomatic consequences. Both readings find real support in the historical record. Neither fully explains her on its own. What is not in dispute is the practical outcome of her reign. She took a bankrupt, religiously fractured, diplomatically isolated kingdom and left it 44 years later, religiously stable, culturally ascendant, and, for the first time in generations, a genuine naval and colonial power beginning to compete on the European stage. She did this without the male heir everyone around her assumed she would need to produce, and largely without the husband everyone assumed she would need to rule beside. Was she the architect of her own singular success? A ruler whose personal caution, intelligence, and carefully constructed public image were the deciding factors in England's stability and survival? Or was she, as some historians argue, fortunate above all, protected by geography, by the ordinary chaos and self-interest of rival European powers who were frequently distracted by their own conflicts, by a genuinely talented set of advisers in Cecil and Walsingham who managed much of the actual governing, and by weather that scattered a Spanish fleet more thoroughly than English cannon ever did? The evidence suggests, as it so often does with genuinely complicated historical figures, that the truth includes elements of both. Elizabeth was neither a flawless political genius single-handedly responsible for England's golden age, nor merely a fortunate figurehead coasting on the competence of the men around her and the accidents of history. She was something harder to categorise and in the end more human. A woman who inherited an impossible position, who made real mistakes and caused real suffering. In Ireland, in her sometimes brutal treatment of religious dissenters on both sides, in the personal costs paid by people like Essex, and arguably by Mary Stuart, and who nonetheless built through decades of patient, careful, frequently anguished decision-making, one of the most stable and consequential reigns in English history. Perhaps the tragedy of Elizabeth Tudor was not that she wanted too much power, but that she was born into a world where the alternative to holding power, for someone in her position, was almost certainly death. From the moment her mother was executed when she was 2 years old, survival and authority were never separate questions for Elizabeth. They were the same question, asked again and again for 69 years. History remembered the Queen, the propaganda, the portraits, the Gloriana of later legend. But behind the crown, for nearly 7 decades, was a woman who spent a lifetime learning, through loss, through fear, through calculation, and through genuine love that she repeatedly chose not to let define her decisions. How not to lose everything. In the end, she did not. What do you think?